In the early 1980s, a new consensus spread among the world's most powerful institutions. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the treasuries of Washington and London have united on a single doctrine. Open your markets, privatize state-owned enterprises, reduce government spending, and growth will follow. This package, later called the Washington Consensus, was presented to developing countries not as a suggestion, but as the only logical path forward. Countries in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia have signed structural adjustment agreements. They cut the subsidies. They liberalized capital flows. They largely accepted foreign investments on terms determined by the investors themselves. And for a while, the GDP figures looked good. But we now understand better that GDP measures the size of an economy, not its health. What was below the headline numbers was completely different. Local industries collapsed because they couldn't compete with cheap imported products. State-owned enterprises, employing hundreds of thousands of people, were often sold to foreign companies at very low prices. Tax revenues have decreased. Schools and hospitals collapsed. And when the inevitable crises came, currency crashes, debt defaults, bank bankruptcies, the people of these countries paid the price, while the creditors came out unharmed. To understand how debt works as a control mechanism, it is necessary to understand the history of government borrowing. After World War II, newly independent countries needed capital. Roads, dams, power grids, schools, the infrastructure of a modern state required money that these young governments did not have. So they borrowed money, mostly from Western banks and institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. In the 1970s, oil-producing countries deposited there unexpectedly large profits in Western banks. These banks, overflowing with petrodollars, were looking for places to invest the money they found willing borrowers in developing countries, and provided loans at low interest rates. The countries accepted this money. Then in 1979, the US Federal Reserve, under the leadership of Chairman Paul Volcker, sharply increased interest rates to combat inflation, and the cost of variable rate debt skyrocketed. Mexico defaulted in 1982. Brazil almost followed suit. The debt crisis of the 1980s had begun. The International Monetary Fund stepped in as a last-ditch lender, but IMF loans were conditional through structural adjustment programs. So a pattern emerged. A country falls into debt, the IMF bails out, and in return leaves a significant portion of control of its economic policies to foreign creditors. This is not a story from the past. Greece experienced it in the 2010s. Argentina has experienced it many times. Zambia, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. Although the mechanisms change, the logic is the same. Debt creates power, power creates dependence. One of the most insidious aspects of this system is that debt grows, rather than decreases over time. Countries borrow to pay off their old debts. They borrow to protect their currencies. Tax revenues borrow as they are weakened by free trade policies, which was the condition of previous debts. This trap feeds itself. This trap has a third dimension: geography and underground resources. Many of the poorest countries in the world actually have great natural wealth. Oil from Nigeria and Venezuela, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, copper from Zambia, lithium from Bolivia. This seems to be an advantage, but it has often been a curse. The resource curse or abundance paradox is one of the most studied topics of the development economy. Countries with large natural resources often experience slower growth, weaker institutions, and more conflict. There are several reasons for this. First, wealth of resources creates easy profits for those who take state control. For example, in Nigeria, oil revenues have been systematically looted for years, and in the Congo, mines have financed deadly conflicts. Secondly, the export of resources strengthens the currency and makes other sectors uncompetitive. This is called the Dutch disease. Third, when foreign companies extract resources, they move most of the original value to their own countries. So billions of dollars flow into developed countries. The result, depleted resources and fragile economies remain. A. deeper problem is that the way rich countries get rich is now closed to poor countries. Countries such as the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany and Japan used protectionist policies while industrializing. China is the exception because it was strong enough to grow without enforcing these rules. For the remaining countries, the ladder has been drawn. This is not only an economic but also a psychological process. Crises are often attributed to local errors and the system is not questioned. This internalizes addiction. In recent years, the system has begun to change. China has offered alternative financing, but this has created new dependencies. The climate crisis and the digital economy have created new layers of inequality. But this trap is not inevitable. Countries such as South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam have overcome it. But this requires strong states, strategy, and independence. After all, it's not an economic issue, it's a political issue. The trap was set with decisions. The only question is, whose decisions?